Welcome, everybody. I wish I could see your faces, but this is our panel on combating anti-Blackness in the AAPI community. Hi, Stephanie. Hi, Huining. My name is Kim Xu. I am an 07, serving my second term as co-chair of DAPA after about a decade-long break alongside Sarah Gupta, class of 2019. DAPA is, our mission is to foster community among the API alumni of the college to further the intellectual, social, cultural, and educational well-being of API alumni and students, and provide the college and the greater college community with our active support in matters of mutual concern. I believe we are in a crucial moment for that mission. So thank you to everyone who suggested tonight's panel and to all of you for joining us. We had 5 different decades represented in the registrants. And thank you to our co-sponsors at RMS and Opal. Some quick housekeeping. This event is being recorded for people who miss it. Our generous guests thought about your questions into big thematic sections, one about the origin of what we are seeing, and a second section on what to do about it practically. I encourage you all to use the chat at all times. We will try to address any questions in the moment, but we did reserve the third section for Q&A, and we ask that you use the Q&A feature for that section. And Sarah will be watching for those. And then a quick note on safe space. Honor your experiences, but please also try to respect the same for others. Use I statements, try not to judge anybody for their question or for being, on a different path. The process of this conversation is way more important than having a perfect vocabulary for it. That said, I'm really excited to introduce our honored guests. Dr. Anna Storti is the Guarini Dean's Postdoctoral Fellow in Asian American Studies at Dartmouth College, where she holds an appointment in the program of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She is at work on her first book, which traces the relationship between racial fetish and racial mixture in Asian American contemporary art and culture. This fall, she will begin as Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University, where she will contribute to their expanding program in Asian American and diaspora studies. And please follow her on Twitter at Anna Storti. And Anna, we're so sorry to lose you, but really glad that we got you for these last couple weeks. Professor Curtiss Takada Rooks graduated from Dartmouth in 1979, double majoring in Asian Studies and Economics, and currently co-chairs the Class of '79 Conversations on Race Committee. It's very cool that you guys have one. He served as Associate Dean of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts at Loyola Marymount University for 8 years before returning to the faculty as Assistant Professor and Program Coordinator, Asian Pacific American Studies. His teaching includes courses in APIA, multiracial identity, TransPacific diaspora, and contemporary APIA community issues. His current research interests focus on Global Nikkei, Japanese ancestry identity, the role of multiracial Japanese Americans in US-Japan relations, and re-appropriation of self-naming among mixed-race Japanese in Japan. So we're very lucky to have you. I thought I would ask each of you to start off by telling us what motivated you to join the event. It's entirely volunteer time. And then if attendees, if you could answer in the chat, we would love that too, since we can't see you. Maybe Anna first.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kim. And first, I'd really just like to thank DAPA for the invitation, and Opal and the Consortium for Race, Migration, and Sexuality Studies for sponsoring the event. I'd also just like to thank Kim again and Sarah again for facilitating, and my gratitude to everyone who is attending. I think it really matters that we're having these conversations, and I think that embodying openness while we're having the conversations and thinking about solidarity is really the only thing that seems worthwhile in this moment, where we just continue to witness unrelenting violence on US soil, and especially right now against Palestinian life and land. So when it comes to thinking about the question of what motivated me to join the event, I think the answer is kind of simple. I align my work with liberation, with the movement for Black lives, with anti-imperialist and abolitionist organizing. So to me, Black liberation is integral to the liberation of us all. And I'm constantly learning. So, I'm excited to learn, but I also have some degrees in ethnic and gender studies. So I hope that I can offer some perspective and learn from Curtiss and from everyone else attending today.
Thank you, Anna. I'm excited to be here tonight. In large part, because I'm a Dartmouth grad. So when I was asked by Kim and Sarah, so thank you very much to join and give me the opportunity to work again with Anna. We've had a wonderful time the past 2 years working on different projects together. But in my conversation with Kim, I was telling her that we probably formed the first Asian student organization back in 1979. Two mixed race Asian Americans and a third Anglo woman who had been a missionary. So she was a third culture person and had grown up in Asia. So, and we were very community oriented. So for me, it was very much a part of that. And the second reason, given the topic on sort of combating anti-Blackness in the Asian American community was my existence as a racialized Black and Japanese body. So as these issues are playing out in sort of theoretical ways they land on me, right? And many, many different ways and my family. And so to be able to speak to this was really important to me, and to be able to speak to my Dartmouth family.
Thank you both so much. And then second quick question in honor of API History Month, would each of you share something about being a part of this community that brings you joy?
Well, since Anna went first, I'll go first this time. I think about the API community as one of my homes. And as home, it's a place of rest. Where you can go when all the other stuff out in the world is piling up on you and just be. The other thing I think about is a place of recreation where you have fun with one another and recreating the different cultural and practices we have. So integrating the ways in which we intersect with other groups and cultures and the like. So we get to recreate ourselves in a lot of different ways as Asian. The third is a place of resistance, where we're able to resist sort of the issues, the sort of racialized issues, the gendered issues, all the things that confront us, but we are able to do it collectively. And so what brings me joy is to have a home. So the API community becomes one of my homes.
I love that, Curtis. And that is similar, I think, to my response to the question, which begins with a gratitude that I am vaccinated. And because I am vaccinated, I was able to surprise my family in Southern California, particularly my mom and my Lola a few weeks ago for Mother's Day. And so they live in Southern California, which is where I was born and raised. And so much of my childhood was spent in the cities of Westminster, Garden Grove, and Anaheim. Which, you know, these are spaces that house so many different diasporic Asian communities. And so after a pandemic year spent in, you know, like lily white Vermont, I was overcome with joy just to be able to be back home with family, eating Filipino food, Vietnamese food, Thai food, Sri Lankan food, and just to be able to spend a few days with them, eating meals from across the Asian diaspora in ways that didn't only restore my soul and my tummy, but also reminded me of just how beautiful it is to be alive right now.
Thank you both so much. Okay, we had a lot of questions fall into our what I thought of as a historical context theme. So I wondered if you could each start by addressing in your study, where does anti-Blackness and colorism in API communities come from?
I'm happy to take this one, Curtis. Go first. Is that cool with you?
Go for it.
It really is such a pressing question. And so, you know, I feel like we can spend a whole semester trying to think about it, but I think the short answer is white supremacy. But oftentimes I like to kind of start these conversations by saying that race exists because of racism and not the other way around. So I think the sentiments behind racism, behind anti-Blackness, actually allowed for the category of race to exist. And oftentimes I think race, like other identity categories, because they're so ingrained in our everyday lives, they're kind of assumed to have always been a thing, but they were actually created and upheld in order to establish a hierarchy of power. And so in the racial hierarchy, white is at top. But this is a relatively new phenomenon. The category of white hadn't actually entered into existence until well into the 1600s. And it was way after English colonizers kind of came to the US soil. And, you know, centuries ago, people who were undermelanated were called English, they were called Scottish or Irish Catholic or even land owning. But once the colonizers came to the US soil, and then in the mid 1600s, they realized they needed to find unique ways to justify indentured servitude and slavery. And so at the time, color existed. And so you would see different documentation of slave owners kind of talking about the enslaved in dehumanizing ways. People who were different shades, they would relate to animals, but still at that time, the concept of race as we understand it today didn't really exist as part of their vocabulary. And there's a lot of work that talks about how the separation of society was drawn much more along the lines of the line separating the rich and the poor. But it was 1676 where poor Africans and poor Englishmen worked together to kind of go against their common enemy, who was the rich. And so this is the, you know, the Bacon Rebellion, which is an uprising in Jamestown, Virginia, a multiracial uprising against indigenous tribes in order to kind of steal land with the hope to eventually bring down the richest of them all, who's this guy named William Berkeley. And so he was the governor of Virginia at the time. And so of course, this guy is trying to retaliate, and he wants to make sure that no one ever tries to take over his power again. So he kills a lot of poor people of all shades, and he works together with his crew to kind of figure out a different way to make sure this never happens again. And so a few years later, white kind of appears for the first time in legal documents, and it's about preventing whites from marrying Africans. So this kind of functioned to create a separation of races, you know, where white people would be able to own land and then Black people would be enslaved for life. So I think in order to talk about this in the context of Asian America and the AAPI community, it's important to understand why and under which conditions anti-Blackness came to exist in the first place, because this isn't that long ago. And I think it's useful to kind of move now into the present to think about this concept that Claire Jean Kim has termed racial triangulation, which is a concept that seeks to understand how Asian Americans are kind of weaponized to mediate and enforce Blackness and whiteness. So in a way, Asian Americans are seen in relation to white people simply because they're not Black. So this is a structural advantage that allows some Asian Americans to be seen as model minorities or to assimilate, but at the same time, they're not white. And so they can be kind of aligned with Blackness because they also experience racism. But this obviously doesn't tell the complexity of people who, like Curtiss and I, are mixed race and differently mixed race. So something that I find useful in thinking about how to talk about racism today is thinking about how eerie it is to think about the strategies like William Berkeley used to prevent an uprising from people by making white people more exceptional. So to literally create divisions. And today, racialized division and difference kind of operates in a similar manner where some people have privileges and some people, there's like the scale between oppression and power. And so, Kimberly Crenshaw's really field shifting theory of intersectionality, I think it's helpful to remember that in any discussion of racism, it's incomplete if we don't also think about the ways gender, sexuality, class, ability, nationalism factor into the story of racialized living. I'll let Curtiss take it away now.
So, you can tell we're both scholars in ethnic studies because we would start at the same place, Bacon's Rebellion, because the other outcome of Bacon's Rebellion was the ways in which those who were brought to trial were punished. White indentured servants were given a longer indentured period, while Blacks who were engaged who were actually indentured servants at the time, became enslaved in perpetuity, meaning not only would they be enslaved, but their progeny would be enslaved. So we began to see a sort of a legal property of whiteness, right? Whiteness now had a value, and that value was freedom. And so in some ways, when we talk about anti-Blackness, it's at one level an epistemological question, right? At the social level, and talking about sort of the ways in which discourse that Anna so wonderfully sort of laid out for us then plays into the narratives that we get, right? Both domestically and internationally, because it isn't just confined to the US. As enslavement and the enslavement of Africans throughout the sort of European colonial empires was sort of embraced, the storytelling about Blacks, the enslaved Blacks, sort of get replicated in other places. And so when we begin to sort of take a look at it, so in that epistemological place, I always ask this question, both of myself and others, is how do we know what we know about Blackness? And then start to interrogate and deconstruct those stories, those narratives. And similarly, and within this exchange, right, there's anti-Blackness within the API community, and there's also some aggressions and animosities that go back the other way, and that's the other side of the coin, is how do Blacks know what they know about Asians? And both are mitigated, and both are sort of within sort of discursive notions, right, are sort of produced by whiteness and white society. So in many respects, what we learn about one another, at least in contemporary times, is at the societal level filtered through a particular racialized understanding of the world. But the other place of it in sort of this anti-Blackness has, and of course, sort of is grounded in sort of a material reality, right? When you look at the sort of how possibly and did Asians come to reside in North America and Central America? Well, certainly the large part of it, though we do have Filipinos who who jumped ship in the 1700s and established the Manila, say that 3 times fast, Manila villages in and around Louisiana. But there's the large corpus of it comes in the coolie, what it is known as the coolie trade, right? Indentured servitude, you call it, labor contracts. It was indentured servitude of Chinese, many of whom were kidnapped, in order to replace enslaved Blacks in the fields in the Caribbean. And they become the next source of labor. When we look at the sort of what is now the United States, we see actively that Chinese in particular are brought to Louisiana, Mississippi to discipline Blacks in Mississippi after the Civil War, during Reconstruction. And we have 4th generation Black Asians in that region of the country. And then finally, if we really think about it in terms of California enters the Union as a free state. And I would surmise that had it been able to, or without the sort of Missouri Compromise, that if California had chosen to be a slave state, which I have no reason to doubt that they wouldn't have, right? There might not have been the need for the Asian labor that sort of comes in, whether you're talking Chinese followed by the Japanese, because as you look at sort of the way in which labor worked in California and the West Coast, Chinese were the first, they get excluded, Japanese are brought in, they get organized, they get excluded, replaced by Filipino South Asians. You get this sort of a way of cheap labor to maintain cheap labor. And in some senses, the very act of being here. And then the last piece within that, but the immigrants themselves were not sort of just individual actors. They, for the Japanese in particular, are part of a nation state. A nation state engaged in an international politics, global international politics, of which they were trying to prove themselves equals, following the sort of Japanese-Russo War, in which Japan becomes the first non-white nation to defeat a white nation. They began to adopt, even then among the sort of elite, sort of this notion of the civilized middle class, which equaled whiteness. And so you begin even in the early 1900s. A great book by Between Two Worlds, Ichiro Izumi. Eiichiro Izumi does a wonderful job of sort of laying out that piece of it. And so you have elements of this model minority image that we've come to fruition for us in the 1960s that get planted. And there's a Latinx scholar, and his name is escaping now, sort of looking at the allure of the middle class as white and civilized. And so because of the narrative sort of established, particularly in the United States, about what is being a good citizen, what is being civilized, what is being, right? It draws all persons of color to this idealized middle class, red-white. And so you see, even within all of our groups, right? This tension between upper middle class, upper class, and working class, right? This desire to separate, and within that you start to see streams of colorism, et cetera. So I think this notion of anti-Blackness is complicated. There's many different ways you could write the essay of how possibly did it come to be, and they would all be correct, but looking at it through different lenses.
I actually wonder, there's a question that popped up in the Q&A already about bias within the AAPI community. He says his father fought the Japanese in World War II, and he often witnessed anti-Japanese, anti-Filipino, anti-Korean, anti-Indian sentiment, all by the Chinese living in Hong Kong. And I think that what I'm gathering from you is that these sentiments are basically invented to keep someone in power. They aren't actually, I can't wait till we get to, yeah.
There's nothing embedded in the DNA that says, if that person, then I, right? And certainly it's part of this sort of larger piece of power, but I also want to be careful, at least in this conversation, and to delineate a bit between sort of anti-Blackness and its role in sort of the America and the establishment of Asian American communities, Asian and Pacific Islander American communities, and the use of Blackness, right, and subsequently anti-Blackness to control or to shape sort of how it is that Asians come to know Blackness or African Americans. The irony being of all of this, right, if we look at the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all of the rights that Asians as immigrants coming to the US, voluntary or involuntarily, that they accrue come from America's need to structurally deal with Blackness in the post-Civil War period. That sort of the lack of involuntary servitude, all those sorts of things, the ability, even though, I mean, certainly there was gender, sex trafficking, but there was an out and they had a legal way to challenge them. Whether or not they were successful is a different story, but at least the right to do that comes out of, right, sort of our ability to not have that. And and I'm given human history, the idea that Asians wouldn't have sold other Asians into slavery is just, you'd have to be silly to think that that wasn't the case, right? We can simply look at some of the things happening in Asia with the Uyghurs and others that says there is no sort of solidarity based on this sort of idealized notion of Asian solidarity. So I think that we look at sort of birth citizenship, we look at equal protections under the law, we look at due process, all those things come from sort of the structural ways of attempting to enfranchise Blacks. Now, as I say this, I will say that because of the values of the United States, there is this fissure that we can exploit, that sort of this notion that all persons are created equal, even though we haven't reached that goal. But that is a stated sort of value. It's the value of fairness and equality in the United States, as again, as poorly as we have lived it out, is the goal that we can at least speak to and strive to, in the way in which our sort of structure, our Constitution, other things are laid out, gives us legal recourse. If we're in other countries that didn't have that, people would just say, so what's your problem, right? I mean, there's no reason, right? So it, and I see someone in the chat saying, who started, even believe it or implement it. Regardless of whether they believed it or not, they put it down on words, and because of that particular Western culture in which written things are valued over non-written things, we do have an element to recourse, where there are other countries where we wouldn't. I'm not trying to say we're the greatest country in the world or any of those other things. I'm just trying to state that we have a way in which we can battle these things. And if we look at Asian American history, we see how the Asian Americans have used the courts over and over again to establish church rights. So we're talking Wong Kim Ark, who establishes birth citizenship, Lau versus Nichols, in which bilingual education is guaranteed. All those sorts of things, right? So we have had a long history of challenging in the courts various things. And so again, I'm not trying to sort of be a sort of patriot waving the American flag saying, look how wonderful we are, because there's a lot that we have to fix. But we do have a particular set of values that allows us to challenge when it's not. And we have sort of legal ability to do that. And again, living up to it is, we've never gotten there. We've never had that idealized notion of democracy, or sort of our Republican democracy. I'm just saying that only in the sense that as we look at how Blackness has been used to keep us from that sort of idealized state of representative democracy, in which all persons are created equal, that it plays a very particular role. Sort of the ways in which sort of Asian stuff plays in Asia certainly is lots of fruit and food for another discussion. But in this particular case, anti-Blackness has been used as a particular cudgel. It's not even subtle. It is a club in order for Asians to recast themselves in various ways, and at the same time allows them to replicate some of the divisions that were based in Asia, on top of it based on color.
That is actually almost all the time that I had devoted to historical context, but I suppose leading into what we can do in solidarity, perhaps we can address we received a question about the history of allied efforts between Black and Asian communities. It sounds like people are doing research, and the 60s and the 70s are the last publicized movements where we work together. Maybe Anna, could you tell us if that's actually the case, or if maybe you could help explain why that perception is there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, yeah, the 60s and the 70s were such a powerful time, especially as they exist in our historical memory. So I continue to read up on the solidarities between the anti-war movement, abolition, and women of color feminism that was coming up at that time, and certainly the student organizers that kind of worked in the Bay Area to demand this liberatory field of study called Third World Studies. You know, of course, the administration kind of caved and negotiated to provide ethnic studies, which is a less radical, more palatable solution. But still, like, this is the moment where different histories were being included in curriculums. And it was also the moment where the racial makeup of the US was diversifying. This is actually a moment that kind of coincides with what is understood as the biracial baby boom. So this is after Loving versus Virginia was passed. But from my perspective, the alliances have always remained strong. I think that people have never stopped doing this transformative work in movements, yes, but also, like, I think that it's important to think about multiracial solidarity beyond the front lines of, like, the images that we think of in our minds when we think of activism. So in the arts, in education, like, this work has never stopped. I think what has stopped, maybe up until now, is the airtime they receive. I think the conversation, particularly about Black and Asian solidarity, hasn't been as prominent since this past summer. And so, you know, media outlets nowadays look different than they did in the mid 20th century. There's a lot of competition. So you really have to curate your own timelines to kind of get the information that you might want to see online. So when I, like, go on my feeds and my timelines, I actually see this work constantly, and I have been since I ever became, like, politicized. I think the challenge is to think expansively about what this work looks like, and for us to ask ourselves to kind of also be the ones to do that work. And so for me, something that I found useful in my classrooms and just kind of, like, with myself, to think about, like, what can I do in this moment, is to rely on, to look back on Depa Ayer's work on the social change ecosystem. So that, like, it kind of maps out these multiple different roles that people can enact in order to kind of pursue liberation and justice. And so obviously, like, there's roles of, like, the agitator. And so sometimes we think about the 60s and 70s and multiracial solidarity, and we oftentimes think of activism and protests, that particular type. But there's also wonderful ways to, there's a myriad amount of ways to think about how we can be helpful in this moment. And so there's roles of frontline responders, caregivers, healers. I identify as a few different things, mostly I think with my work as an academic and as a teacher, a guide. So, I'm someone who tries to rely on the time that I've spent reading and writing. And so I try to reference that knowledge to other people. And also within my work, a weaver is a different role. So to kind of be able to see the connections between different time periods and to make that clear to others. And so, referencing the question that had been posed in the chat, I think it's important to just think about the common enemy as being white supremacy. And so to then think about that, and realize what I'm trying to say is that people of color have been pit against one another in very strategic ways. So you can think about in the post-Civil War era, plantation owners would describe Asian American laborers as docile, submissive, and obedient hard workers in ways that were unlike African Americans. And so again, this obviously created competition. And then, to even just think about the many different ways that Black and Asian people were set against each other is useful, but to then think about anti-Black, anti-Asian sentiments within Black communities, I think actually kind of obscures the real issue, which is thinking about how white supremacy is the one doing it. So even when we talk about it, it's useful just to be thoughtful and careful with the way that we're framing these questions. Because, of course, knowledge is important. It's helpful to know the history, but it's also really hard to retain all of it. And it's not necessarily fun material to hold on to. And so I think the question of kind of what to do next is important. I hope we can talk more about it, but I guess that's kind of a long-winded way to say, I think that I know that these alliances are still doing the work.
I mean, you can go back to sort of alliances that the Black member of Congress was the only one to speak out against the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, up through the work in breaking housing covenants in LA and Northern California. The work of Scott Kirshuye does a really wonderful job of looking at that in sort of Los Angeles and sort of the Japanese and Black coalitions to break those covenants. So long before the 60s marches, et cetera, right? And there was, you go back and look at all of sort of school pictures and who sort of hung out with whom. And so there was a lot of on the ground solidarity and mixing and all those sorts of things, and I think of the ways in which sort of at the individual level, because sometimes we think of sort of solidarity as only at these large, big political movement things, but a lot of work gets done or are able to get done from the work people do with their one-to-one relationships. For my mother who comes to Manhattan, Kansas from Japan, married to a Black man with 2 mixed race sons, right? She gets adopted by the sort of Black matriarchy in the Black community in Manhattan, Kansas. Becomes a member of a Black church. She becomes a secretary officer in that church for 30, 40 years. She joins Eastern Star. She joins Sisters of Cyrene. She does all the Black fraternal women's organizations. They did a number of local community-based organizations to raise scholarships for particularly Black kids, but students of color going to college, a whole number of different things. And so you can find lots of those stories, right? But unfortunately, oftentimes the stories we tell ourselves, and also Blacks working in Asian American communities, unfortunately, the story we tell ourselves collectively as communities, AAPI communities, too often gets mitigated by the larger social narrative that Anna talked about, sort of where we're pitted against one another, right? Gary Okihiro talks about it, yet that kinship has been obscured from our range of vision. And that common cause turned into a competition for access to resources. He writes in his book, Margins of Mainstream, in the chapter called Is Yellow Black or White, right? And so, he's being very clear that sort of these narratives that we adopt for ourselves, the story we tell ourselves, are incomplete. And so we have to work hard. And given the audience we're talking to now, hell, we're Ivy League graduates, damn it. If anyone can't do that kind of educational work, that kind of reading work, who can, right? That's our wheelhouse, right? And so that part I would encourage us to sort of continue to do, to find those other narratives, to actually talk to people in your communities, but get down and get beneath and get into those sort of individual stories in lots of different ways. But I just think the way in which history, we think of academia as sort of a free market that isn't driven by what's sellable. But, tragedy and conflict sells, even in academia. Normal's not good. Nobody wants to publish an article on normal. So we have marketing pressures, even within our disciplinary specialties, and within the academy, right? Only very recently, that's 68, if we're lucky, right? Where that type of scholarship has even been recognized, let alone appreciated.
Thank you for saying that, Curtiss. I know it's hard to call out your own field when you're a part of it. So
I've been doing it for 20, 30 years.
I definitely feel the same, not in academia, but in my industry. If we could move into, I'd love to have some time with, for those of us who are understanding what you're saying, but when you go out into your daily life and you see, whether it's your family or something on social media, and you see that how can we practice solidarity in real life with actual decisions?
I just finished a project interviewing a number of community-based organizations engaged in civic engagement, voter engagement, and the like, and their sort of activities over the past year. One of the interesting things I found in that particular project was that first, this notion of white adjacency in the Asian American community, and sort of white proximity. It doesn't apply across the board to all Asian groups, right? So one of the things that was interesting is that for certain Filipino, Pacific Islanders, certain communities of Southeast Asians, that their proximity was to darkness or Black and brown communities. So, and in the case in California, Pacific Islanders, there was a great deal of intermarriage. So as these on the ground working with people, communities began to sort of sort out how to deal with anti-Blackness, the first step that they took was inward, self-reflection on sort of how much anti-Blackness do I personally hold? Does our organization hold? Sort of that first self-interrogation, but creating a safe place for people to have that self-interrogation so that they could be wrong, bad, whatever thing that you want to say, and work through to discover how possibly I came to hold these views. The other thing in the sort of Pacific Islander communities, they found that they needed spaces to help them in a very real way in terms of parenting. How do I parent a Black child, right? Because as someone who is mixed Black and Asian, trust me, when I get discriminated against because of my Blackness, they don't give a rat's behind that I'm half Japanese.
Wait,
right?
I missed the first, I think you cut out for the first part of this sentence, and now I'm really...
Okay, so I was saying that as someone who is mixed Black, sort of Black Asian, when I get discriminated against because of my Blackness, nobody gives a rat's behind that I'm half Japanese, right? When a police car pulls up behind me, I'm not gonna get out of anything by saying, oh, by the way, you don't need to do this, I'm half Japanese, right? They're gonna, put your hands behind your head, the whole nine, right? And so, I think one of the things that these organizations have done is really worked hard at sort of addressing the anti-Blackness. I'll stop that with step one and let Anna speak, because I could speak forever and I want to stop for you. So I'll take a breath.
I mean, the work is really speaking forever on this. But I just want to address what Neil said in the chat about how the Ivy League, is actually trying to teach whiteness. And so I'm not a graduate of Dartmouth, but I operate within academia. I'm literally at Dartmouth right now, virtually, literally. But to think about how institutions like the Ivy League, but like academia writ large, seek to kind of create and enforce. It's not just sustaining it, but it's really just enforcing the different ways that whiteness finds life, which is actually not only in white bodies and white people, but in people of color. So it's you can be a person of color and do a really white thing. And so I think when it comes to thinking about practical ways to be in solidarity, I think yes, knowledge matters, reading matters, but if you are a graduate of the Ivy League and you have money, direct your resources to Black-led, queer and trans-led organizations, set up monthly donations. Ever since I was able to earn not a graduate student salary, I've been able to set up monthly donations to bail funds. I've, obviously spent time reading, but I do think it's important to actually put your money where your mouth is. And just to reiterate something about what Curtiss said, I think that it really it begins when kind of transforming the way we think from an individual mode to a collective mode, which is a different way to think about the personal scale. And so rather than having our identities as Asian Americans inform our interests in Asian American social justice, how can a move toward collectivity be the mode in which solidarity and liberation becomes possible? Because I think that we should care about issues even when it's not us on the line. And so because we should care about the people and the life that we share the earth with. So for me, it really is this kind of ongoing, lifelong learning, unlearning, to mention, I think what someone had said in the chat also about orienting to life in this way that is committed to working towards a world that protects Black lives and all lives, and kind of doing what we can in the moment to make that world a reality. And because it's such a monumental task, a way I like to think about it is in the pursuit. And this is kind of a common thing that a lot of organizers say. It's not necessarily about, tomorrow we wake up and the world is what we want it to be. Because, on the scale of the world, that's really hard to do. But on your own individual scale, you can create a life, a family, a home that does not perpetuate anti-Blackness. And so, yeah, the scale of the personal, to study, to support, to donate, and then on the community scale to kind of think about those roles again that I had mentioned of DEPIER, social change ecosystem, and then on the structural change, this is, I think, the biggest stage. I believe that abolition is the only way forward. So I spend time familiarizing myself, and we can all spend time familiarizing ourselves and following people, just kind of learning from them as we're, living life.
I think that one of the things is that to investigate what is our default thought, right? If I'm working and I'm looking at doing hiring, what's my default of who I think is qualified? And is that racialized? And pushing myself through that. If I'm thinking if I'm doing my own personal buying or purchasing for a company, et cetera, what is the default vendor that I go to? All those things, sort of examining what I call our defaults. I mean, Beverly Tatum in her piece, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria and other stories about race, really lays it out to say that, if you don't have sort of white racialized thoughts, your first thought is going to be a white racialized thought. And if that's not the case, that means you must not be breathing in the United States, right? You must be, because we're taught so well. And again, the Ivy Leagues are a place that doesn't. And so we could spend a lot of time sort of being pissed off about what the Ivy League does or doesn't do. And I'll stipulate to all that stuff that the Ivy League does. You go in, that's whatever you are, you come out of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. I mean, that's what they want from you, right? And we said that back in the 70s. So this isn't something new. We all fought against having that happen to us. But and that's an is problem, right? So what do we do with that is? And that then sort of, we have to interrogate what we do with our own lives. Who do we spend time with? What authors do we read? What, again, as Anna said, what causes do we give to? Where do we put our money? And where do we in our organizations push what our organizations do? I do work with some Japanese American youth organizations, and I'm constantly pushing them to do partnerships with Black youth organizations, which really pisses a lot of their parents off. But such is life. But I mean, because if you live in a bubble, then it's theoretical, right? And I guess one of the views I've had, one of the sort of advantages I've had as growing up in the way that I have, both Asian American community and Black community have not been bubbles to me. And I've had to negotiate the white community in the meantime. And so, and through my family, we're very much engaged in the Latinx community. So it's the more bubbled you are, the easier it is when it gets hot for you to retreat back to safeness, right? Or when you take your foot off the pedal, you will revert back to it. As Tatum says, racism, being anti-racist is really hard work. It's like being on a moving sidewalk, right? As long as, in order to go in the opposite direction of a moving sidewalk, in order to overcome it, you have to exert more energy than the sidewalk. The moment you get a little bit tired and rest, you lose ground, right? And so it's not easy. There's nothing easy about it, which means then you have to do it collectively. You have to have others around you to support you, to encourage you, to hold on to you when you're too tired to walk on that moving sidewalk and carry you. And so, but that takes work to find those people. They are not, you can't go to a grocery store and just pick them off the shelf.
That actually transitions, or it connects really nicely to a last couple of questions before I really turn it over to attendees. But we had questions about what are the ways that anti-Blackness harms API communities, and sort of on the other end of it, how do we use this movement to deconstruct other oppressive structures within the API community? And then if that one feels like it's covered already, there is a question sort of to what Curtiss was discussing, which someone wrote in saying that educating the people that are close to you, a lot of what we heard was family, can get really exhausting, and it can lead you to question yourself? How do you find that balance between educating and just letting go? And if educating isn't the solution, then what else can you do? So I know those are both big questions, but maybe Anna, if you would start with a.
So the second question is kind of about what to do when it doesn't seem like education's working. Can you remind me what the first part of the question was, or question one?
It was a little to deal with being exhausted by the people close to you, and how that might lead to questioning yourself. Where to find the balance?
Yeah, I think it's a lifelong, at least for me, you know, it's been up and down. I'm like the most radical person in my family. And so, you know, I was a very like loud feminist when I was in college. And so I would talk about everything during Thanksgiving, you know, during all the different holiday gatherings. And it never went well. You know, I didn't really know how to kind of like think strategically about my tone. So I was doing a lot of like gentle yelling to try to like convince the people I love to like join me on my side of like pursuing justice in this way. And I would even try to kind of historicize and analyze the own, you know, very imperial legacies that brought my family to the United States. You know, so on my father's side, that's Italian immigration. And on my mother's side, it's the Philippines, which is a former colony of the US. And so I think it's really important to just unpack how hard it can be and just to appreciate how hard it can be. And, you know, like in moments you can find joy in the pursuit, but it's not always, I don't oftentimes see the results in the moment. It's different when I'm teaching, you know, students, because I think it's, there's not that emotional familial connection. And I'm also not necessarily a child. I'm still kind of viewed maybe as like a younger person, except to the people who I'm older than. But I think it's important to just know, you know, you can't always do it all. And so it's okay if you like pick and choose different moments or spaces in which you want to kind of put on the role of being an educator. And so as someone who's literally an educator, I've had to just allow myself that if I'm with family, I don't always need to be doing that. And I have to kind of be gentle with myself to just accept that some people might just not be able to get there in the same way. But as with, you know, experience, I've also become a lot better with tone. I actually had this, as I mentioned, I was in California last week, and I was talking to my dad about prison abolition and like what it would mean to have a world without police. And so, you know, a common reaction to that conversation is like, well, what's going to happen, you know, when all the bad guys are out? And like, what are you going to do when you're driving and no one's following the traffic rules? But I was able to kind of be measured and to kind of enter the conversation in a way that was about a conversation, rather than just like, I'm telling you what's right and what's wrong. Because I think oftentimes once you're on this lifelong path of learning to be anti-racist, sometimes we forget that other people are at a different point in the journey. And so like, we're like maybe like years in, maybe a month in, but some people are just starting. And so in order to have that conversation requires just an understanding, you know, not everyone can just be like, I'm never going to call the cops again. Like that takes some time. It takes, you know, an ability. It also takes, you know, luxury of time to think about these things. You know, we all have different struggles that we're enduring, and healing is not linear. It takes time. And so, you know, I think while we juggle our own histories, that means we're also juggling with different bounds of trauma. And so, you know, I just think that when educating is not enough, you can find different way. You can find joy. You know, you can kind of like lean in and just like take in a lot of media of marginalized communities, and like think about the ways that being a person of color isn't just always about being disenfranchised and being under the threat of violence on multiple forms and under multiple forces. So it's, you know, I think that that work is also educating, and it's helpful just to take some space away if it's not useful for you. It doesn't mean that you're a failure. It doesn't mean that you're not doing the work if you aren't able to do it, and if it's not kind of healthy for you in that moment.
And I think when we're talking about doing that work in family, right? Family is the place where we're centered as, and sort of, without speaking to any individual situation, but for particularly within the Asian American and African American context, family is where we're centered. We aren't always going to agree with family, right? And that's hard as we have different experiences. Their life experience is different. I'm thinking about sort of just between Anna and I are sort of the family we've created, but you know, I'm 64 years old. And so when she was talking about the reading about the 60s, I was living it. Right? So there's this whole different other way of understanding things. And I've always been a body puncher, so I'm not, you probably will never see a photo of me with a sign or marching in a protest, but I do a lot of, when I say body punching, I've been an administrator in higher ed since I was 23. And so, you know, I've been working, sort of pushing things, trying to push the envelope on things on the inside, recognizing that sometimes the answer wasn't trying to get people to say yes, was just getting them not to say no, right? Because a yes isn't always possible. With our parents and with our aunties and uncles of the other generation, yes may not be possible, but getting them not to say no might be, right? And so it's sort of recalibrating sort of what success is, right? In some respects. You know, when I look at my own journey, growing up, you know, as a person born in the 50s, and sort of feminism was on the rise in the 60s, and in a lot of ways, the Black community is fairly conservative, and in other ways, things too, and that's the community I was raised in. So the notion of a woman taking a man's name was, not taking a man's name was controversial at the time, and it was very politicized. And I remember talking with one of my, a woman friend. I was just graduated from Dartmouth. I was coaching football at Penn State, and this was a neighbor that I had met, and got to know pretty well. And we were out walking and talking at one point, and we were talking about sort of the feminist issues, and this thing came up, and she said, you know, I simply want to die with the name I was born with. And that made all the difference to me of understanding sort of where she was coming from. It wasn't political, it wasn't anything, it was purely personal. The right for every person to value that the person to die with the name that they were born with. Me was, I got it. It was epiphanal in some ways, right? I mean, there were a lot of women who got me to that point, so I could have heard it. So all those conversations at night with all my friends at Dartmouth, other places, got me to that. But I was able to hear that, right? So that notion of tone, and I think ultimately someone said there's no right or wrong in the chat, but I would say that I would agree with Martin Luther King, who says that there's this arc of moral justice, I mean, sort of a notion of justice, right? It bends toward justice. And for me, justice is that we recognize that every person matters, that every person matters, that there's value in each person and who and what they do. And if every other person looked at every other person they saw as someone who mattered, justice would take care of itself, right? So how do you get to an abolitionist state? Well, if every other person matters, the choices you make, right, are different. But, you know, and I think part of working with the older generation, since I'm pretty much almost there, has to do is letting them talk about their experience and then finding those parts of harmony or parallels. Particularly when we talk to immigrant experience. There's a reason they're not in their country of origin. And oftentimes it is a tragic story. And that if they can link their sense of tragedy and trauma to the trauma of Blackness in the context of this conversation, you have an opening for them not to say no. They may never get to yes, but you might just get them not to say no.
That's a really good suggestion. Thank you. And I definitely feel you on the working on tone, because I usually have a hard time with that one as well. Can you both see the Q&A box? I have a couple that we could start with. Ariel is asking if you can recall an individual conversation about anti-Blackness with a member of the API community that was successful in breaking through, and what you found effective. Curtiss, you did sort of address this as reminding an immigrant of what we have in common. Anna, do you feel like you have had a success story? It's hard to apply.
It is. Yeah, there's one conversation that kind of came to mind. I have a friend, and in college, you know, I don't know when woke kind of came to be a term. I don't remember. But, you know, she's Taiwanese, and she would kind of ask me questions, I think trying to understand my kind of racial background because I'm mixed. And so she would ask me questions like, are you more, or do you identify more with your white side or your Asian side? And also try to understand like, okay, so you're white and you're Asian. And so I would have to kind of have conversations with her about being like, I'm not white, I'm Asian, I have white heritage. There are ways that I have light skin privilege. Depending on where I am, I can pass. But then that kind of like led to her kind of making a problematic comment that I just don't feel like is useful to repeat in this moment. But I think having it kind of allowed for us to have a conversation about Blackness, and to think about like the complicated way that people can understand appropriation. And so I think she was trying to like understand how I am not a typical Asian because I love basketball and I can play basketball. And so I was trying to have a conversation with her about, and I kind of used the frame of cultural appropriation to talk about how Black culture is oftentimes taken and exploited and adored without actually thinking about the ways that the people who consume Black culture would not also treat Black people in a nice, in a you know, just way. And so I think that like it's not, that was a long time ago. And so I don't know what it would look like now. Generally now, most of, you know, I have been picky with who's in my life. I think especially, I mean, it's been a year in a pandemic, so I haven't seen that many people. And a lot of the conversations that I've been having with people have been intentional. I kind of want to have conversations with people who are trying to like think about moving forward. And so yeah, it's a difficult line to kind of walk when you want to, at least for me, you know, if someone is, you know, racist, as I think, you know, Christina Sharp is someone who, she's a scholar who writes about how anti-Blackness is total climate. So if we think about how, you know, the climate, the weather, it's every day, it endures. It's something that you wake up, there is going to be weather. And so she writes about how anti-Blackness is as pervasive as the weather. And so for me, it's kind of less about worrying if, you know, don't worry about being anti-Black, appreciate and understand and really feel that anti-Blackness is pervasive. And so of course, like being alive right now means that we are, you know, having to interact with anti-Blackness. And so the job is to like, it might be useful to even frame it in that way, to say that less about feeling guilty and feeling bad about ourselves and just knowing that this is the world and it's the ethical, moral thing to do is to make it less anti-Black so that soon and eventually that will be what the world is.
My working with it, they have to deal with me. So, and sort of, they can't sort of escape sort of the Black component of it, even though I've had some folks in the J community saying, when they've seen me in more Black spaces, talking much more in that arena. And in America or worldwide, I'm never not Black. I'm never allowed not to be Black. So I'll start there, no matter whatever ethnic practices, whether I'm speaking only Japanese, living in Japan, and I've had the privilege of living, in Japan and all over the United States, in the Midwest, the South, the Southeast, before the Civil Rights Acts were passed, which privilege is probably not the right word, the experience of living in those settings where the segregation was enforced and real. All those different things, right? And as the world changed through them, during the Charlottesville uprising, I had a conversation with one of my dear friends from high school who is white. And as we were going through this piece, and they were talking about the tearing down of statues and other things, and just a lot of the things that were happening. And in particular, I think it revolved around Robert E. Lee at some point. So I had to remind them, if he had won, our friendship couldn't exist. And all the richness that we've had with each other would have been denied. And this person, it was a woman, and in high school, we were really good friends. We did a lot together. And in Kansas, we paid the price for it at times to have that friendship. In the 70s. And so reminding her of that friendship, the challenges that we overcame together, all those sorts of things, but that in this case, if Robert E. Lee won, none of that would have been possible, right? And so again, I think at the individual level, when you're sort of combating, you have to find those places of connection with your life. And as Anna said, you have to decide whether it's worth it to you at that particular moment. Because, in some cases it's not, right? I've had someone say to me, what kind of work do you do? Well, I do nigger work. Like, oh, great, this is going to be a fun conversation. But not challenging them then, waiting until I've developed a much better relationship with that person. Even a year and a half later said, remember when we first met and you said that? That really hurt. And here's why. Then we were able to have a conversation. If I had attached it when it happened, we probably would never have been friends. We would have fought. All the defenses would have been up. And not that they necessarily named their child after me, but their son's name is Curtiss. So it's those sorts of ways in which we can affect people, but we also have to think of it too sometimes as planting what I call the mustard seed. To use our grace and kindness to advance a thought, recognizing that it will not germinate while we're there, but that perhaps one day it will be a huge mustard tree from this little bitty seed that you were able to plant. And that's the part of faith that I have. The faith that people generally want to do good things by other people. And that if I can tap into that at some level, but I don't have to see the result. And that allows me to sort of change my tone or manage my tone. And there are other times when I'll just slap someone right in the forehead, right? Bam, right? Because they need that. But to have a large arsenal of approaches that you can, some of it's life experience, some of it is just thinking about it and thinking about the settings and how might I approach this? Remembering the past conversations and when it went sideways.
Thank you for both of those perspectives. And thank you for sharing. I think it is, I don't know if you both have this issue sometimes, but if you are a minority, as soon as you bring up something personal, it feels like, oh, I sold my minority status to get through to someone, but sometimes you have to, but at the same time, I have to thank you for bringing yourselves into the conversation, as well as the history and education. I figured Jasmine, I hope we sort of spoke to your question. I wanted to see if we could talk about Kenta Takamori's question. It is, okay, it's about education. He says, I clearly recall when in my 10th grade US history class, public school in the state of New York, we spent 5 minutes on the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. It was treated as an event that took place during war, which of course it was, but I think it needs to be viewed within a continuum of civil rights history, including that of Indigenous Americans, Black slavery, and Chinese railway workers. Can you comment on what can be done about how Americans learn or relearn history, which shapes the foundations of how different groups of color recognize or fail to recognize how their histories are interwoven and built on the shoulders of those who came before, since we are all at an educational institution? If you had any recommendations.
I would recommend reading Ron Takaki's Different Mirror. It's a good history sort of understanding. Even Irish were considered not white at one point, and so their lives were forfeit. You know, that our bodies and lives have been forfeit to sort of the sort of American economic enterprise is a historical fact that sort of draws us all together. And as Anna said, and in the process of the construction of whiteness, there's been various times that each group has been almost considered part of, and in the case of people of color, eventually jettisoned until we get to model minority. Then we get to have honorary whiteness for certain classes of Asian Americans, right? But yet even that is not, it's the other side of that coin is yellow peril, right? As long as you don't want to be the CEO of the company, as long as you don't want to be the head of surgery, as long as you don't want to be the, right? It's all good. As long as you recognize and stay in your glass ceiling place, right? Or bamboo ceiling place, or bamboo and glass ceiling place if you're an Asian woman. I think, Ken, you're absolutely right in the sense that these are all sort of integrated in the ways that you could see them within a continuum, although I don't know that I might make it a little more complex, in a matrix, a three-dimensional matrix, and you can see the interrelationships between them. But yeah, it's sort of the way in which our particular enterprise, economic enterprise, has been built, and the way in which the variables have been defined it will take a sort of at least an ideological revolution, if not a revolution itself. But as far for ourselves, though, I would start with reading Takaki's Different Mirror.
Yeah, and continuing that spirit, I think understanding that whatever is taught in the classroom is something that's taught, but there is always going to be so much more to learn. And so I think that, you know, in the pursuit to combat anti-Blackness, you know, being here is like one way that you're trying to like fill in the gaps. But also like, it's just, there's always going to be more work. There's always going to be more histories that are not only just not taught, but not easily available. And there's reasons for that. I think histories of coalitional politics and activism, you know, are not good to have readily available for the same reasons that we had mentioned about those who want to remain in power don't want it to be made readily available. And even in the pursuit of, creating archives, there are some stories that are more easily documented than others. And so I think that, my pursuit is kind of not along thinking about different ways to implement policy, to change the curriculum. I think that matters, but I think that if you have children or if you know young people, to talk with them about these things. There are so many good children's books about many of the topics that we had talked about. So I think starting young will, that would be, I wish that I was learning these things, before I entered into an ethnic studies classroom my second year of college. Because I think that now I know in hindsight that, wow, I didn't really even pay attention that much in history because it didn't really feel, like it mattered to me. It was very much whitewashed. And yes, I'm in America, I'm a citizen, so I should learn that national history. But, Gary Okahiro has been great about talking about how Americans' history is a history of Asian America, and how looking at examples of, ethnic studies only helps enliven, illuminate, and complete the actual narrative of what this nation is. So I think, just accepting that what we've been taught is not complete. What we've learned is monumental, but there is so much more to learn.
I'd reiterate what Anna said about children's books, right? The nice part about as you get older and you're a big uncle or big auntie, and or you start to have your own kids, but they don't always have to be books that are confronting racism and this, that. Just, I smell honey in a sweet potato pie. I hear catfish crackers as I watch them fry. And it just children's books that expose the lives of all who inhabit the planet.
And humanize them in ways that are real. That
are very real, like the meals that we eat. That particular story called I Smell Honey in a Sweet Potato Pie by the McKittricks inspired me to write one for my daughter that was about sort of our foods and the way in which we do things. Right. So, but humanizing, because, just the richness of family, right? That and for my daughter, we read Native American stories, we read Latinx stories in both English and Spanish. We read Japanese American, Chinese American, we read African American, particularly African American at some point, because we, as a sort of person of Black ancestry, she needed to have a sense that it wasn't all about the struggle and always about being discriminated against, that there was great joy in Black culture as well. And being a critical race scholar, I don't think I always presented that to her because I was too busy fighting all the damn time, right? But it forced me then to look for those stories in those books. It was really important.
I thank you both for that suggestion. It's really nice to, I think that it's really nice to hear that you don't have to solve the systemic issue with policy before trying to resolve the issue in your, if you have kids in your kid's life. And that helps. I feel like that helps. Okay, we only have 5 minutes. I thought it might be nice to, first I want to acknowledge Hayden's question, which I feel like is a whole nother topic, and lecture with Dr. Storti. In your work with racial fetish, are there any observations to be made between the Black and AAPI communities in their history of being deemed sexually non-normative subjects, thinking about post-slavery marriage laws mentioned earlier, I think that's a whole nother lecture, but if you want to address it, you can briefly, but so you can also go to bed if you have to. Ray asked if you could leave us with a story, both personal or not, of Black and Asian solidarity or cultural appreciation that we could take with us that's positive. I love that Curtiss has put the answer. Oh no, that's not the answer, but it's a different, it could still be the answer. Maybe either question.
I mean,
Sure.
in terms of, just to talk about Hayden's question, it's a great question. Hayden, let's talk. We're due for a meeting anyways, but without having to get too much into it, what I will say is that I think that reiterate something I had mentioned earlier, that any conversation about racism truly is incomplete if we don't think about the sexual dimensions of racism. And I think that racial desire is oftentimes kind of like not an okay subject to talk about. It's a little tricky. It's hard to really curate. It's hard to compile evidence to think about how one's desire might be racist. But I think that, you know, there's a lot of historical examples of how thinking about Asian women, Black men are kind of viewed as hypersexualized people. And so that has had its, you know, roots in history and imperialism and colonialism and settler violence, but also finds itself still prevalent today. And so we have 2 minutes. And so I would love to talk with Hayden about that and encourage others to read up on this. But to answer the question on something positive, I think it's the thing that comes to my mind is a Netflix show that I had just watched. It's called City of Ghosts. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but it is so good. It is it's an animated show, and it's about kids who are in Los Angeles. And it's like a multiracial group of kids who kind of embark on figuring out and kind of helping the ghosts that are in their lives. And so it follows different communities around LA, Indigenous communities, Black communities, Asian communities, talks about race, ethnicity, disability, the past, death in really gorgeous ways. And it's, you know, really accessible for kids as well. And so I think when thinking about Black and Asian solidarity and the positives, or at least just wanting to think about the good and the joyful and the pleasurable, oftentimes for me, that's where art takes me, you know, art, culture, the music that I listen to, the people that I watch, the artists that I support, the, you know, people that I watch on screen. And so I think that even the people that we read, you know, so to, you know, think about how someone like Toni Morrison continues to be a guide, even though she's no longer here. And she was someone who wrote novels. You know, she wasn't necessarily on the streets in the same way that someone like Angela Davis was, and Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs. And so people who are, you know, no longer with us, Angela Davis is with us, but then also remembering that there are, you know, people today doing this work, and you are someone who's doing that work, and you can continue doing that work. And so I think that's pretty positive.
So I can think of two things. One, when I first moved to Los Angeles, because I didn't grow up on the West Coast, and one of the reasons I took the job was because of just when I visited Pomona College, I came out there as a dean of students, student affairs person. Just looking at the student body, which is more diverse than anything I'd seen on the East Coast, was one of the reasons. And they had a Japanese American community, and I got to know some folks. And I went to this nightclub in Gardena, which is a sort of Japanese American suburb, and with a Japanese American friend. And so we go into this nightclub, and all the music is funk. This is in the early 80s. It was just straight up funk. And all I can remember looking around with all the Japanese faces, Black music, thinking was, I'm home, right? This is like, it was the perfect, for me, sort of the confluence of who I was, right? Sort of the aesthetic of the Black aesthetic within a Japanese family setting. The other, Diane Fujino, who wrote a wonderful biography of Yuri Kochiyama, when she got married to an African American, at their wedding, they had African drummers and taiko drummers performing at different times. But if you know anything about drummers, once the performance stuff was over and there was some downtime, drummers drum, and they started doing their thing. And they began to sort of riff off of one another, and they went back and forth, because, you know, American taiko comes out of actually South LA and the sort of Crenshaw district at Senshin Buddhist Temple, right? So they started jamming and riffing, going back and forth, and it wasn't long before it was off the chain. Just the ways in which they were sort of combining beats and rhythms and the way they heard sounds, and it can never be that moment won't be recreated. It was sort of jazz of its own, but it was a beautiful sort of allegory for me that says, if we get together, allow ourselves to hear and listen, we can make some incredible jazz as people. And so watching today, I'm working with some folks in LA right now, in a Japan Black LA initiative with the Black churches and the Japanese consulate. And they've had a glorious time learning from one another so far. And again, putting them in the same place, allowing them to hear each other, they create their own rhythm.
Yay. Thank you both so much. That was a beautiful conversation, and we're glad it's recorded. Anna gave us some resources. I think that we also caught a couple of things. So those of you who are attending, will send out links to those so you can have them. We didn't want to do a PowerPoint or anything, but otherwise, hopefully you get the DAPA newsletter, MS newsletter, and Opal emails. The whole rest of this month is packed with events. Thank you so much for this evening. And thank you, Curtiss and Anna, so much. I don't think there are two other people who could have reproduced your insight on this particular topic. So we are really lucky to have both of you and both of you together. So we are so grateful. Thank you. And thank you all. Take care. I think I just shut this. Oh, thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.